And we now move on to our second panel on political disinformation, dynamics, and remedies. And it's really a pleasure to introduce the chair for this panel, who is David Smith. As well as being a lecturer at the University of Leicester, David serves as the managing editor of the journal. And, you know, his job can be summarized as, you know, without him, there would be no journal. There would be no articles getting peer reviewed. There would be no, you know, issues of the journal being assembled. It is absolutely essential, all the work that he does. And I'm very grateful for his dedication and his precision. And I'm sure he also has, you know, a bright career ahead of him as a researcher, as he's already showing. So it's my great pleasure to introduce David Smith as the chair of this panel. David, take it away.
Thanks, Christian. Thanks very much for that introduction. Hi, everyone. So really looking forward to this one on political disinformation. We have 3 papers, and it's a very international affair. We have representation, I think, from 4 continents. So please post all questions and comments as you have been to the chat. Use the hashtag IJPP20 if you are a Twitter user. I will try to give a 15-minute warning, and then obviously we'll have 25 minutes in total for both presentation and discussion. And obviously then for the discussion, I'll select some questions for the presenters to answer. First of all, we have Ivor Gaber from the University of Sussex and Caroline Fisher from the University of Canberra. I believe Ivor, I've seen him in the participants already. I believe maybe he will be presenting on online strategic lying and permission to lie. So if you're there, Ivor, then take it away.
Hi, thanks. Start sharing screen. Right. David, is that okay? You can see it?
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah, if you can, I'll see you over. Right, good morning, welcome. And yeah, I'm presenting, but my colleague Caroline Fisher, who's in Canberra, is joining us, is on board and will help me with the questions, or may take them direct, depending how difficult they are. She gets the difficult ones. Let me just compliment Christian, apart from the general organisation, this scheduling is brilliant, because I'm going to segue neatly out of the previous presentation, because Brexit, surprise, surprise, has been a bit of an obsession, but it's been a real lesson learning experience for those of us involved in political communication. Caroline and I discussed this and came up with this notion of strategic lying and permission to lie. Initially, we, so to speak, spotted it with Brexit, and then it came back to us in terms of the UK election. The argument that we're advancing, oops, let me just get rid of the pictures. Politicians lie is not new, but it used to come at a cost, resignation or defeat. We're arguing now that politicians appear to have been granted a permission to lie without cost. We'll obviously explain this in more. EU Leave campaigners in 2016, that's when we had the Brexit referendum, and the Conservatives in 2019 successfully mobilised what we're calling the strategic lie. The lies were blatant, but rebuttal, as we'll explain, was never a problem. The purpose of the lie is to shift the news agenda onto or away from key issues. And it appears to work, but we argue it has great dangers for our democracy. How did we get there? Well, very briefly, and I hope this is familiar material for most of you online, I guess modern political PR begins with propaganda at the start of the 20th century, governments discovering the power of information. One thinks of the Spanish-American War, the Boer War, the First World War, all of which were moments when governments realized they could, hopefully, if from their point of view, affect public opinion. It became sort of respectable. Walter Lippmann and Edward Bernays in the interwar period were great, both theorists, if you like, and practitioners of PR. I suppose its next landmark was spin. It really starts with Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher and the people that they assembled around them, and that we're all familiar, I hope, with spin. I formulated the notion of extreme spin, and the best example of that was Tony Blair and George Bush's representations that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction as the justification for the invasion of Iraq. The difference between spin and extreme spin, spin, as my colleague Caroline has put it, is put your best foot forward, glass is half full. Do everything you can to burnish your own image and tarnish your opponents. Extreme spin was don't lie, and we'll come back to that, but do what you can to mislead, deceive, give people a false opinion. I suppose one was positive, one was negative. Extreme spin had a diversion which was called bullshitting, which Harry Frankfurter, I knew it couldn't be long before his face appeared. Harry Frankfurter formulated the notion, just hiding, just trying to get it away so I can read my own script. Harry Frankfurter formulated in 2005. Donald Kellner recently described Trump, a classic case of the bullshitter who makes things up as he goes along and fabulates, exaggerates, dissembles, lies and bullshits as a mode of course and way of life. But this isn't quite strategic lying. This is seat of the pants, make it up as you go along. It's strategic lying is planned and thought out, as we'll say, formulated in advance. To define it, it's not spontaneous, it's developed in conjunction with political consultants. It is planned. The lie is told expecting it to be rebutted. Rebuttals tend to reinforce the original message and maintain focus on key narratives or distract from unhelpful ones. So I'm going to pause because I'm still finding the video in the way and it's distracting me from being able to see my lovely slides. There we go. The rebuttals tend to reinforce the original message and maintain focus on key narratives or distract from the unhelpful ones. We'll come back to how it works in practice. But the lie essentially is used to drive or distract the news agenda, and that is its purpose. And it is repeated widely, both on and offline, and online has made it ever so much more powerful. But for the strategy to work, politicians need permission to lie. And there we have two practitioners. Permission to lie is granted to politicians by an electorate that increasingly appears to accept that politicians lie, but fails to sanction them for doing so. And we can point to the example of Trump's election in 2016, Johnson's in 2019, but much more widely, we could Bolsonaro in Brazil. Berlusconi managed to achieve permission to lie many years ago in Italy. There is a very close relationship between populism and strategic lying, which we haven't got time to go into, but the populist followers give their leader permission to lie. And then they also retransmit his or her messages because they believe them. And we'll come back to that a little bit, but we're not in this paper dealing with populism and political, but we have in the paper, which we have uploaded, there is a much more lengthy discussion about the relationship between populism and political lying, strategic lying. So let's look at my case studies, and apologies in that they relate to UK events, but I think they have, as I've just mentioned, wider ramifications. So we're dealing with Brexit, which was in 2016, and the 29 election. It all begins with Brexit, the Brexit bus, as we called it. Many of you will be familiar with. Thank God that's the one. I'm sorry, that's not you, David, is it? We send the EU £350 million a week. Let's fund our NHS instead, vote leave. It was a brilliant slogan. Unfortunately, it wasn't true. All of the experts, including the British Treasury, said that figure was a ridiculous exaggeration. The real sum, argued one way or another, was probably 170 million. This was a gross figure, took no account of anything, but it was very effective. And it was particularly effective because of this man, who many of you will recognize, although there are doubts as to whether he was recognized at Perugia Airport earlier, where there were claims that he had flown there with his new girlfriend. But clearly that somebody got him mixed up with Tony Blair, appears to be. Forgive the distraction, that was just in this morning's papers. What was brilliant about the campaign was they made sure that whenever Johnson or anybody else did an interview, he stood in front of the bus. It was real reinforcement stuff. and it appeared to work. That figure, 350 million, every time the EU campaign, the Remain campaign has said it's not true, simply reinforced it. The advertisers call it banging on the bruise. Once you've made your impact, every time your name is seen, the impact, you reinforce the message. That's why companies spend billions on getting their name on a football shirt or on a motor racing car or whatever. There's no message there, it's just banging on the bruise. And it was thanks to this man. I know he looks a little loony in that, and he is quite loony, but he is not to be underestimated. This is Dominic Cummings, who was the strategist behind the EU campaign, but also is now Johnson's chief advisor. And he said, he wrote an extensive blog in after the Brexit referendum, which he modestly published, and he analysed it. He did not admit that the 350 million was a lie. But he said, we send the EU 350 million to provoke people into argument. This worked much better than I thought it was, he says modestly again, a brilliant communications ploy. I remember seeing at the start of the campaign a 6-minute interview on ITV National News here, and the interviewer completely demolished the 350 million figure. But it didn't matter. It meant that 6 minutes of a leading UK bulletin was devoted to talking about we send 350 million. Another argument was Turkey. Turkey is joining the EU. That might be news to most of you. Certainly under Erdogan, there's not the faintest chance of it. Turkey had made a formal application 30 years ago and nothing much is happening. And in fact, not much is going to happen. But it played to the xenophobia, which was particularly played up by this man, Nigel Farage, who had a rival Leave campaign. And I just noticed when I was putting this presentation together that in the bottom left corner, if you can see it, it's photobombed by somebody with a brave woman holding a poster, Britain Stronger in Europe. This poster was deemed very effective because these millions of migrants streaming into Britain, hold on, they're not coming into Britain. These are Syrians, Afghanistanis, Iraqi refugees streaming into mainland Europe, into Greece, into the Balkans. They came nowhere near Britain. We lamentably let very, very few in, but it was a very effective image. And again, Farage, again looking very pleased with himself, said if Boris, Gove and Gisela, his campaigners, had not picked up the baseball bat marked Turkey, NHS 350 million, with 5 weeks to go, then 650,000 votes, which was the difference between winning and losing, would have been lost. So he attributes the victory of the Leave campaign to these two strategic lies. It's impossible, as you all know from opinion research, to prove these things, but there's very effective evidence that these key issues played with voters. Then the second case study, the 2019 general election, there's no question the Conservatives lied. First Draft News, which is a very well-informed fact checker, noted in the penultimate week of the 2019 general election campaign, that's the most important week, 88% of Conservative Party's Facebook adverts contained suspect information, compared to 6.7% of the Labour Party's. Let's just look at how this worked in terms of strategic lying. These were key Conservative campaign themes. Brexit, get Brexit done, and you know what a mess that is now turning into with the Irish border. A strong economy, the Tories are always very good, seen as very competent on the economy, and a strong NHS, that's defending their position that Labour attacks them on very effectively, saying it's not safe in their hands. And then the bottom left, the Labour Party, the party of tax and spend. How does it work? Well, here's a video, I hope the sound works. Right at the start of the campaign, Keir Starmer, who is now leader of the Labour Party, was Brexit spokesperson. And he gave an interview to a morning news show, which was immediately doctored by the Tories, who put out this video, this doctored video, making it look like he had no answer to the question of where does Labour's Brexit position.
We can't hear the sound. I think it's because you need to share your sound, but perhaps you can just tell us.
Yeah, basically what happens is, oh, that's a pity, I don't know how to share sound. Basically what happens is there's a pause. The interviewer says, why would the EU give you a good deal? And he looks like he can't answer the question. But in fact, that was completely edited. As I will carry on playing it just and keep talking, and because you can't hear the sound, you can hear me. You'll see in the actual clip, which was posted shortly afterwards, he completely fluently answers the question. And then in the subsequent, you can see he's holding there, but the original answer, you can just see that he immediately goes into an answer, and it's the same question, and it was completely doctored. And the Tories knew, there he goes straight into the answer, and I'm sorry you can't see it, and I won't play this, but this is ironically named chairman of the Conservative Party, James Cleverly, who says, oh, it was a joke, everybody could see it was a joke, we put on the funny music, everybody knew it was a joke, but of course it didn't. But it didn't matter, they knew it would be immediately rebutted, but they got onto the political agenda in a big way, Labour's failure on Brexit, not to have a clear policy. It was such a mess, they didn't have, even their spokesperson couldn't answer it. And then, last two examples, they created fake websites to reinforce their strategic lie. If you typed into a search engine, Labour's 2019 manifesto, this is what you got, and you can see in very small type, a website by the Conservative Party with hitting their three themes: no plan for Brexit, higher taxes, more referendum. And then perhaps worse still, they set up during debates between Corbyn, who was then leader of the Labour Party, and Johnson, a fake fact check site. You can see it says fact check UK, looks very legitimate. You would have found it if you typed into a website, fact check political leaders or whatever. And in very small letters, it says from CCHQ, which is Conservative Central Headquarters. And it's got the Twitter blue tick to suggest it has credibility, etc., which Twitter was very cross about. So let me now why strategic lying works, because once a message has been established in the minds of partisans, it is very difficult to shift. Rebutting the message and demonstrating that it is not factually correct does little other than to reinforce it as the partisan mind summons up its defenses against cognitive dissonance. This is from the literature of social psychology, political behavior, allegations of fake news to serve to amplify these processes. In other words, and I haven't gone into the literature, which we do in great detail in the paper, the more you try and rebut a strong message that has been sown in the public mind, the more you reinforce it. One quick diversion, a variation on the strategic lie is the dead cat bounce, which some of you will be familiar with, which is used when you want to shift something off the political agenda. You suddenly introduce something completely unexpected. The idea, it's a stock market term, but when a negative issue is running in the news agenda against you, you throw in a completely sensational, fictitious story, which takes the news media's attention away from the original story, the theory being, who remembers what you're talking about if a dead cat suddenly drops down from nowhere? And that's a variation, a negative variation. And let me conclude with a quote from a admittedly left-wing journalist, but I think she summarized the Tory campaign and strategic lying. She got to it in a sense before we did in a very journalistic way, but I think it's a good quote. Slash and burn, lie with impunity, tell whatever falsehood you fancy, especially one that has a propensity to go viral. Get your smear heard as widely as possible, and if you're challenged, just lie. Far more people will see your initial lie than the follow-up correction, and few people will take the time to research any statistical embroidery or rewriting of the party's stance or record. That's from Dawn Foster. So we have a long paper on the website, please look at it. But here I am, here is Caroline, I hope, and we're ready for any questions.
Great, thank you very much, Ivor. Very interesting paper. We have several minutes now for questions, and we already have one from Maymay or Meme. I apologise if I've mispronounced that. Very good question, which is, the media empower politicians to lie. What can journalists do to change that? So how much responsibility and agency do journalists have in this process?
I think at this point, a difficult question, which I hand over to Caroline. Unmute.
Thanks, Ivor. Thanks for presenting. Gosh, the media empower politicians to lie. What can journalists do to change that? I mean, ideally, they don't empower politicians to lie. I think it's, I think that there is, certainly in Australia and in parts, I think there's less scrutiny going on. And I think we really have fallen into this he said, she said style of reporting rather than really challenging the false claims or the dubious claims that politicians are making. I think we really need to pull back on this, you know, he said, she said, and scrutinise a lot more. I mean, it's getting harder. I mean, in some ways you have to give the journalists a bit of slack because, of course, the politicians, you know, publish directly now to their audiences. They're not the first gatekeeper in many instances anymore, and particularly with a lot of these lies which are being spread on social media. So they're playing catch up all the time as well. So, you know, the lie is bolted before they get a chance to scrutinise it.
Great, thanks. The next question is from Imka, and they say, do you have data on whether the fake Keir Starmer interview or the fake Labour manifesto were believed or had an impact on the vote outcome?
I think so. Firstly, it's worth saying that, you can hear me? Can you hear me?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Firstly, I think it's worth saying that that very morning, the BBC replayed the Dr. Starmer video, and it received 1.2 million hits on YouTube. It was viewed 1.2 million times on YouTube in 24 hours. So an awful lot of people saw the doctored video. Secondly, throughout the campaign, Labour trailed very badly in public opinion in terms of Brexit. And 6 months, 9 months on, despite the terrible mess that the Tories are making of Brexit, Labour still trails the Conservatives on Brexit. So I think that general message that Labour's incompetent on Brexit, and at least Brexit might be bad, but at least we know where we're going, cut through. So I think it was very effective. But of course, as we all know, proving a direct relationship between media content and political behaviour is virtually impossible. One does it by supposition, pulling together, because of course people cannot really articulate why they voted in a particular way for all sorts of reasons.
Great. The next question is, I believe, from Peter Van Aelst, who asks, is strategic lying a good term? It seems that these strategies to mislead are much broader than simply lying. For example, what if they put 170 million on the bus? Would it not be problematic?
Whose term was it? I think it was my term, wasn't it, Caroline? You invented permission.
Yeah, you can own that one.
You invented permission. It's an interesting question. Strategic misleading. You raise a very interesting question. Would 170 million have made a difference? It's probably not. It was just getting onto the mainstream news agenda, establishing in the Brexit referendum that it was all about us sending money, our money, giving it to Brussels when we should be spending it on the NHS. So it was the broad theme, I accept. Would I have been happier if it said 170 million margin? It would have swapped my paper a bit because it would have been less easy to describe it as a lie. But all right, Peter, let me throw it. Was it from Peter, that question? Let me throw it back to you. Got any ideas? What would you call it?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Do you understand me? Yeah. I'm a bit in doubt because the lie suggests that the politicians are always completely aware of the falsehood. And we've seen some research on Donald Trump where he's simply, and therefore the term bullshits, because he's not always aware telling the falsehoods. And if you look at the campaign of the Conservatives, you see indeed it's very strategic, it's well thought through. Sometimes there's a lie, sometimes it's not. But if you focus only on the lying, I think part of your story gets lost. So I think, therefore, I would be careful to use that term, because what you're trying to tell here, I'm not sure whether misleading is better, but it's much broader. But take out a few of the lies and it would be all fine? No, because indeed what you say is yeah. For instance, on the bus, the fact that they suggest that all that money would go to healthcare is also quite misleading, as they admitted afterwards. So it's not simply about the factual falsehoods in there. That's part of that broader strategy, I would say. So therefore, I think strategic lying would in my case, would focus all my attention on the falsehoods. And I would rather look for different dimensions in their strategy. I'm just thinking out loud here.
Well, I'll comment and I'll see if I can. I think that's very interesting. I do think the advantage, if you like, of the lie is it immediately excites or it immediately brings forward rebuttal. And actually the liar wants rebuttal. They want to keep the issue on the agenda. Just go back, we mentioned it in the paper. Trump's birther controversy about Obama, but then now subsequently about, oh my God, I can't remember, Kamala Harris. He knows that they are both absolutely legitimately and able to be president, but he just wants to get it on the agenda. Having said that, I don't think Trump is actually a strategic liar. He's a bullshitter. He makes it up as he goes along. And I do think that's different. So although I take your point about the word lie, I do think strategy is important. And I don't think that Trump's lies are strategic.
Peter, can I add something else? Thanks very much for raising that, because we did debate around what we should call it. The other thing is, yes, okay, I see what you're saying about this other stuff being misleading, but I guess what we were trying to say is, spin is misleading. That is the nature of spin. Spin is distortion. It is, inflating, augmenting, playing with the truth. So that's not new. I guess what we were trying to pinpoint was the actual lying, which seems to be more prevalent, and we did focus in on the lie, because misleading is just a general, misleading people, tampering with the truth, bending it, is just a staple of spin.
Okay, I'm afraid we're going to have to finish the discussion there, although you can continue to ask and answer questions in the chat. Thank you very much, both of you, for that. The next paper now will be titled Losing Friends Over Politics, Understanding Social Sanctions on Facebook and WhatsApp in the US and Brazil. I certainly can see that Patricia Rossini of the University of Liverpool is here. She's, I think, in the waiting room of the Good Place, the background there you have. So I presume you'll be presenting, and take it away.
Thank you. Great pleasure to be here. My name is Patricia Rossini. I'm a Derby Fellow in the Department of Communication and Media at the University of Liverpool. Share my screen in just a second. Slight correction that we took WhatsApp out of this particular analysis, but all right. Do you all see my screen?
Yep.
Not in presenter mode, right? Okay, yep. Perfect. Right. So, and this paper is with my colleagues, Stromer-Galley at the University of Syracuse, Vanessa de Oliveira, and Edda Baptista at the Federal University of Minas Gerais. Just for background, in hopeful times, gone were the days of the, great web 2.0. Everyone can talk about politics, and that's awesome. Everyone can participate using social media. So good. And also with all this free information online, everyone can be super informed. So, those were the hopes of the good old days when we all started studying the internet, and we thought it would be this great thing for democracy. But then things didn't quite turn out the way we thought they would, right? So when we talk about participation, we also tend to talk about polarization. And when we talk about political discussion, there are scholars raising concerns about uncivil and intolerant discussions. And the more we talk about diverse information and how easy it is to find free information, we more and more talk about misinformation and how hard it is to find information that's legitimate. So in a nutshell, like all our hopes and dreams of how the internet would be great for democracy have been just crushed over and over again. Just quite sad. In this particular realm, we focus a bit more on polarization and disagreement. A lot of research in the past few decades has been consistently demonstrating that social media use is typically associated with a lot of positive democratic outcomes, such as political participation, both online and offline, exposure to diverse political conversations, and etc. But there are now some emerging evidence that people are starting to be worn out by political debates online, and even find it stressful or frustrating to interact with people they disagree with. And some scholars have suggested that this may lead to politically motivated selective avoidance, which so far in the several countries it's been studied has been considered a relatively rare behavior. So why the selective avoidance matters, right? Like in the very beginning, like, 90s and early 2000s, there were a lot of discussions about echo chambers and how people using the internet, given the choice, would basically just enclose themselves in spaces of politically homogeneous identities. And decades of research, again, prove that this is not true. And especially in the realm of social media, people tend to be exposed to diverse opinions, mainly because we tend not to choose our friends based on politics. But in contrast, what selective avoidance would suggest is that, well, yes, it may be the case that most people don't necessarily choose friends based on politics, but it is possible that people will selectively exclude themselves from conversations, which then in turn may lead to echo chambers, and though that in turn may lead to more polarization, which over time drives politically motivated intolerance. So what we know from prior research is that political discussion with weak ties, so with people that you don't really know or don't know that closely, can be a predictor of unfriending on social media. We also know that this type of selective avoidant behavior is more likely in large social networks. If you have hundreds of friends, you don't really care if you're cutting some ties, right? We also know that partisans are more likely to engage in selective avoidance, but and contrary to expectations and even my expectations, prior research has not suggested that exposure to disagreement is what is associated with unfriending, unfollowing, or blocking on social media. In the past, work focused on selective avoidance has mainly looked at this behavior like as a form of user filtration. So as if you were tailoring your Facebook feed or Twitter feed to only show you what you want. And that is basically focusing on content and not necessarily relationships. And has also emphasized behavior and contextual explanations. So contextual such as number of ties you have, and behavioral, and also disagreement, presence of disagreement, and so on. At least to our knowledge, no research has investigated selectively avoidant behaviors in response to heated, offensive, or uncivil conversations. And part of what we've been arguing that these behaviors in turn become kind of social sanctions is that when selective avoidance takes place as a response to uncivil conversations, they may take a form of social sanctioning insofar as they can affect personal relationships. So a bunch of our research questions and hypotheses. This is a comparative study, so we had expectations that we would see different behaviors in the United States as compared to Brazil, and I explain these in just a second. But mainly, we expected that social media users in the United States would be more likely than Brazilians to use social sanctions on Facebook. Based on prior research, we also hypothesized that politically extreme users are going to be the ones more likely to use social sanctions. And our set of research questions were asking if users are more likely to employ social sanctions and if they felt offended by a political discussion, participated in a heated debate, or were attacked during a political discussion. Part of the rationale for comparing US and Brazil, these are the two largest social media markets in the West, first and second, respectively. Brazil has a very intensively online population, and a lot of people who are online are also on social media. I mean, along with India, we are the only ones that make Orkut a thing back in the early 2000s. So we're very heavily social media users. These two countries, albeit with differences, have high internet penetration and high social media penetration. But we believe that two important cultural differences might explain different selective avoidant behaviors. In particular, thinking about Hofstede's cultural dimensions, the United States scores pretty high in individualism, and Brazil scores pretty low. And what that would mean is that Brazilians tend to privilege and care a lot about social belonging and social groups, not only inside their families, but also extended social groups, and they carry those for a long time. Right. And secondly, Brazil scores pretty high in uncertainty avoidance, and the United States scores pretty low. And in our hypothesis, this would go in the same direction because Brazilians would be less likely to employ social sanctions because they have lower tolerance for ambiguity and conflict. So they wouldn't sever relationships, for reasons, for instance, related to politics. If you are Brazilian, and I know there are a bunch of Brazilians are here, we have this saying that you never talk about politics, football, or religion in a dinner table, because we are kind of trained to avoid those types of conflicts. So for our methods, we used online survey panels for the United States and in Brazil. In Brazil, we also supplemented the online interviews with a bunch of phone interviews, and that was mainly because in some regions in Brazil, it's very hard to get enough penetration of internet users using online survey panels. We use quotas for age, gender, and education. And in the case of Brazil, we also included the region as a quota dimension. The dependent variable for the analysis is blocking or hiding content on Facebook. And the independent variables are frequency of political talk, frequency of exposure to disagreement, political extremity, having heated conversations, being offended, being attacked, and the basic demographics. Just to give a sense of to what extent these uncivil discussions happen, and this in the, you may be able to see the wording of the questions. I can't because the video is blocking it. But you can see the differences between Brazil and the US to the extent to which people reported having participated in heated conversations, to what extent they reported feeling offended during a political conversation, which doesn't necessarily mean that they were personally offended. And for that, we have the second one that says that they have been personally attacked during a political discussion. So we can see that there are differences between countries in all dimensions, with these behaviors being reported more frequently in Brazil, and particularly in the case of heated conversations. I mean, a third of Brazilians have reported participating in heated conversations on Facebook, whereas just a fifth of US respondents. Similarly with feeling offended. For our results, so the first hypothesis, oh, I forgot what was the first hypothesis. Sorry. Yeah, that we would find differences. Oh, yes, that we would find differences between Brazil and the United States to the extent that people reported hiding or blocking content from someone in their contact list for reasons related to politics. And we found that no, not really. People reported roughly the same frequency of those behaviors. About 1 in 4 in each country said this happened to them. And therefore, there are no meaningful or significant differences between these two countries. Then for the other hypotheses and research questions, these are the coefficients of a regression model. First, for political extremism, red is US, blue is Brazil. We can see that political extremism is only significant for Brazilians and not in the United States, which is to some extent intriguing, because prior research had suggested that political extremism or partisanship would be a significant predictor in the United States, and we did not find that, but that was definitely the case in Brazil. As for the 3 indicators of having uncivil conversations, feeling offended and being personally attacked are pretty strong predictors of blocking or hiding content on Facebook, both in the United States and in Brazil. And engaging in heated conversations was only significant in Brazil, not significant in the United States. We also see up here, and I don't think I have, oh, I don't have it. We also see up here that frequency of cross-cutting exposure, so exposure to disagreement, was significant predictor in both countries, which again is also not in line with what has been previously found. So some of the takeaways. First, selective avoidance doesn't really seem to be a rare behavior. So prior studies had reported it happening around like 10, 15% of the time. And we found it in roughly 25% of the time in both countries, with no differences between countries. So it's definitely becoming something that people do. We found that uncivil political discussions, especially the ones that make people feel offended or during which people are personally attacked, were strong predictors of blocking and hiding on Facebook, which to me strengthens this idea that these are social sanctions and these are happening in response to something that happened to you and someone said to you during a political discussion. As I mentioned before, we found that exposure to disagreement was a predictor for blocking and hiding in both countries. And in terms of country differences, we found that Brazilians were more likely to social sanctions in two conditions that were not significant for Americans, mainly among politically extreme users and those engaged in heated conversations. And even though the country differences, at least at the top level, first hypothesis country differences were not there, we do think that this result for Brazil can be to some extent explained by this idea that because Brazilians score high in uncertainty avoidance, they might actually be more likely to actively filter out disagreeable relationships, especially if they are partisan, because they might believe that avoiding that type of disagreement and avoiding that type of uncertainty might be more relevant than preserving certain social connections. And since this is a study focusing on Facebook, we all know that we collect a bunch of people on Facebook that don't really matter or mean that much to us. So it just might be an easier type of environment for people to engage in this type of behavior. So why does this matter? One of the main reasons why I think part of these results are a bit alarming is that even though it is possible that a lot of people don't engage in selective avoidance, it has the potential to polarize the polarized, and that is especially the case in Brazil. So the fact that partisans are more likely to engage in those types of behaviors means that these are the people who are selecting themselves into enclaves of homogeneous opinions, and therefore they might become, over time, less tolerant to political difference. And with that, I will thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Patricia. So we already have a few questions coming in. Keep them coming. The first is from Carolina, who says that your hypotheses are built around the behavior of people being attacked. What about those who are attacking? Would you make a distinction between those two groups?
Well, we didn't have that's an interesting question. So this is a survey, right? And these are self-reported measures. We didn't have a question about whether you attacked someone, which in retrospect, I wish I had, but at the same time, I wonder to what extent people would say, yes, I did. And I also wonder, especially in the feeling offended piece, right? Because the reason why we had these two distinct measures was that, yeah, someone can say like, you're an idiot, but also someone can say, I don't know, academics are idiots and we might all be offended, right? But we're not being personally attacked by that. So I think it would be a difficult measure to get in a survey to say, have you attacked someone? But I'll keep that in mind and maybe do that next time. Because I wonder, like, actually, that's a gap that we don't have. Sorry.
Great. The next question is from Ayala. He says, regarding the cultural differences, what about levels of political polarization in the US and Brazil? Do you think this might have anything to do with your results?
Yes, I do. I think polarization for Brazilians is kind of a recent thing. I mean, it is a country that only redemocratized about 20-ish years ago, right? And even though we have been having, somewhat polarized political elections ever since, these haven't been at the level of polarization that we've been seeing in Brazil ever since 2012, 2013. So I think Brazilians might have fewer abilities to deal with polarization just because it's a recent phenomenon, whereas Americans might just be more used to those divisions. I think the other dimension is that political polarization in the United States is pretty straightforward. You have two parties, you're either a Republican or Democrat. In Brazil, you have over 30 parties, and not a lot of people can situate where those parties lie in the ideological spectrum. At the same time, you may have local coalitions and regional coalitions that might defy your mental recognition of where parties lie, right? Like you have the Workers' Party in coalition with center and center-right parties sometimes in local elections and regions. So I think Brazilians just, I do think there's a difference there. And I think mainly the difference is that Brazilians are still getting used to the level and the intensity of polarization that we have in the country. And that's a relatively new phenomenon, whereas arguably not the same for the United States.
Okay. The next point is a comment. Maybe you could comment on it, or we can move on to the question. The next question. That comment is from Jamaluddin, who says, I was expecting data on how many have unfriended their Facebook friends. And then the question is from Diego, who says, are you planning to extend this research to other platforms such as TikTok? It will be interesting to spot differences or similarities across platforms. And I guess that comes to something that I was going to raise, which is about, you mentioned that you dropped the WhatsApp part of this project. So maybe we could talk about, coming back to that comment as well, platform effects, the kinds of different affordances of platforms and how they might correspond with some of these behaviors.
Yeah, so the unfriended, we asked in the question, it was unfriending, blocking, or hiding. So it was just all three behaviors. We didn't differentiate, which again, big gap that I wish I did differently. In terms of extending it to TikTok, I think there's something to be said about social relationships, and TikTok is not necessarily a social network in a sense that you don't necessarily friend people, and therefore, even though people might employ selective avoidance on TikTok, it would be different dynamics than we're observing here. On the WhatsApp point, we did an analysis on WhatsApp focusing on Brazil only. Part of the reason why we dropped it for this comparison, along with just short time to put this all together, was that in our Brazilian sample, everyone is on WhatsApp, 100% is on WhatsApp. And in our American sample, just about 28% are on WhatsApp. So they are substantially different platforms, and we didn't have enough, like for these two countries, and they might serve pretty different purposes. So it didn't feel like a good basis of comparison to do a cross-country comparison of WhatsApp, since WhatsApp in the US is not WhatsApp in Brazil. I mean, in Brazil, WhatsApp is the main platform that people do everything from talking to friends to conducting businesses. And in the United States, this is just not as pervasive. So part of the reason we dropped it from this analysis was that it didn't feel like a good basis for comparison, WhatsApp users in the US or in Brazil. But we do have the data analysis for Brazil only data comparing Facebook to WhatsApp. And in that analysis, we find pretty concerning patterns, if I recall, because these behaviors are more likely to happen on WhatsApp, where people are connecting to closer ties, and therefore we find further evidence that, especially for the polarized, uncivil political discussions on WhatsApp are driving, the end of relationships and friendships.
Thank you. Kimberly asks, I believe data was collected in Brazil closer to election time in comparison with the USA. Do you think this impacted the results? And if so, in what manner?
Yeah, so in Brazil, the data was collected in, if I recall now, May 2019. In the US was November 2018. So there was actually an election going on in the United States by that time. We had the midterms in 2018, but we didn't have anything related to the elections in the survey. So hopefully that didn't affect that much. But again, both countries were experiencing elections or electoral cycles during that time. This project was originally supposed to be during the elections, but this was funded by WhatsApp, and WhatsApp took forever to actually fund it. So we delayed our data collection by months. So yeah, it was the aftermath of the election, and certainly people's experiences in the elections might have led them to respond things one way or another. At the same time, one could expect that being a couple of months, well, 5-6 months after the election, there would also be a chill out effect, that like all those fights that you picked out with Bolsonaro supporters would probably now be on the back burner, trying to like make those friendships again. You had to endure Christmas with your family members, right? So hopefully there might be some influence for sure, especially in how divisive the elections were in Brazil. But we hope that the survey was a bit far enough from the election so that emotions wouldn't be as heated as they were. But then again, like, it's Brazil after 2018, so there's really no good time, is there?
Okay. The next question is from Namita. You'd probably be best placed to answer this one. It's the slide takeaways. Does this indicate that Brazilians maybe have a more emotional culture, or are they more emotional than Americans? And Renee asks, do you think this creates an echo chamber where the information people get is aligned to their own beliefs? So, how does this research correspond to that kind of literature?
Yeah, I do think, and as I mentioned in the other response, that Brazilians are just not yet used to dealing with polarization that much, and they might take these political disagreements too personal, and that might be what explains why we found a higher likelihood of Brazilians engaging in social sanctions in all conditions, including just participating in heated discussions, which was not a significant coefficient for the US sample. And this can potentially create an echo chamber insofar as if people are selectively avoiding the other side, that does mean that they are actively seeking belief confirming types of information. And the evidence that we had in the past when we were all debunking this myth of the internet would just lead to a bunch of echo chambers was that, yes, people may selectively pick the sources of information that they want that are somewhat confirming their beliefs, but there was no real evidence that they would selectively avoid heterogeneous or contradictory information, particularly in the realm of social media, where again friendships are made on the basis of other types of relationships and associations, not necessarily about politics. And the fact that in the realm of social media now we are seeing this behavior that's no longer rare of people selectively unfriending, blocking, and hiding content from friends that they have on those platforms might in fact mean that for these people who engage in this type of behavior, they might be building for themselves an echo chamber where they only see opinions that they agree with and that they actively avoid opinions they disagree with. And that's pretty problematic.
Okay, I think we have just about enough time for one final question, if that's okay. You've already commented on some of the kinds of the platform kind of features that make comparing platforms kind of complicated. Anna asks, related to the polarization issue, do inequalities make a difference? Brazilians are heavy users, but access depends highly on mobile devices that do not allow people to get into the content beyond titles, memes, etc., because of the high cost of connection. So does the lack of information and heated discussions lead to more uncivil exchanges, and does this matter? So yeah, I don't know how to necessarily summarize that, but maybe, do things like the brevity of communication, the mode of communication, do they affect the way in which these things happen? I hope I've accurately summarized that, Anna.
No, thanks, Anna. That's a great question. Actually, that suggests to me that we could potentially include information patterns, like consumption of information patterns, or even political knowledge in these models to try to get at this question you're mentioning. I do agree that to some extent it is possible that lack of information with heated discussions might lead to more uncivil exchanges, and this may matter for sure. But the models that we have presented here did not account for information or media diets, and we also did not account for political knowledge. But that's something that we certainly could do. So I'll thanks for the suggestion. I'll include that in the final paper.
Okay, many thanks, Patricia, for an excellent presentation. We need to move on now to the next presentation. And the title of this is Resilience to Disinformation, a comparative analysis of engagement with disinformation on social media. And I believe I've seen Anna, Sophie, and Peter in the participants earlier. So I don't know who's presenting. It looks like Anna is taking up the baton. So over to you, Anna.
Okay. Hello, everybody. Can you hear me and see everything? Thank you very much for the introduction. I'm very happy to present also on behalf of my co-authors, Edda Humprecht, Sophie Morosoli, Peter van Aelst, and Frank Esser, our study about resilience to disinformation in cross-national comparison. During the global crisis, unfortunately, we also had to face a huge amount of mis and disinformation, especially on social media. There was, for example, the rumor that everybody has to stay inside for a certain time because helicopters will spray disinfectants into the air to kill the virus. Or there were a lot of health, individual health advices, such as the one that we should gargle water with salt or vinegar. Or another famous claim or more conspiracy theory is that the new coronavirus was manufactured before the outbreak, and that there is already a vaccine owned by the Bill Gates Foundation. You may have heard of some of those claims because they actually have spread in countries all over the world. And in our study, we are now interested in what may help to prevent people from spreading disinformation, and especially if there are different ways to go in different countries. So first, what do we mean when we're talking about mis and disinformation? We can distinguish these two concepts based on the attributes falseness and the intention to harm. So when we talk about mis and disinformation, we focus on false content, but the two concepts differ regarding the intention to harm. Whereas misinformation includes unintended, false, or misleading content, disinformation is deliberately manipulated content that is false and has the intention to harm for political or economic reasons. We've built our study on a theoretical framework by Humprecht, Esser, and Van Aelst 2020, which states that even though disinformation is a problem that all countries face, some countries seem to be better equipped, more stable, adaptive, or more resilient to disinformation based on structural factors. And the authors introduced the concept of resilience. And the idea is that certain macro level conditions can limit or foster the consumption and diffusion of disinformation, and therefore the resilience. And resilience can be defined as the capacity of groups bound together in a community to sustain their well-being in the face of challenges to it. And the causes of these challenges usually come less from unforeseeable shock events, but more from structural malformations which evolved through a longer period of time. And such malformations are, for example, the polarization of societies, the media fragmentation, or the distrust in institutions. So the resilience refers to a structural context in which disinformation not mainly reaches a smaller number of citizens, but mostly in which people consume and handle disinformation differently, and in which they are less inclined to engage and further distribute disinformation when they are exposed to it. And based on several macro level factors which foster or limit this resilience to disinformation, Humprecht, Esser, and Van Aelst identified clusters of countries with different levels of resilience, here from a high resilience on the left to a decrease in resilience to the right. And these factors which influence the resilience of countries are part of the political environment, referring to polarization and populism. They are part of the media environment, referring to trust in the news media and the strength of public service broadcasters. And factors are part of the economic environment, referring to the market size and social media use. And our research interest of this study is now whether predictors of resilience at the country level can be transferred to the individual level. And so we would test the resilience limiting factors and explore the extent to which individual behavior varies across countries. Therefore, we ask in a first step, how do citizens from different countries vary in their willingness to disseminate disinformation? And further, we test and investigate the resilience factors in more detail and build the following hypotheses. First of all, research has shown that disinformation is most effective when it is consistent with previous beliefs, when the so-called confirmation bias influences how people perceive and interpret certain information in line with their own values. And because party supporters often hold strong beliefs, we expect that a strong partisanship lowers the resilience and increases the likelihood to disseminate disinformation. Second, previous studies have linked disinformation to populist communication, because on the one hand, the populist ideology again fosters strong beliefs and an in-group, out-group thinking. And on the other hand, the style of populist communication can be misleading, since it is emotional, filled with negativity, and often suggests that there are alternative truths. We therefore expect that supporters of populist parties are more used to and more likely to accept this communication style, and that they are therefore less resilient to disinformation. In terms of the media environment, we consider trust as a relevant concept, as well as the media diet of citizens, which are both closely connected. Producers of disinformation often claim that they themselves present the real truth and the information which is deliberately hidden by the established news media. So if citizens don't trust the news media and their fact-checking, they are more open to alternative news sources which may spread disinformation. And we therefore expect that a high trust in the media increases resilience, and that a high use of alternative sources makes citizens less resilient to disinformation. Further, the use of public service broadcasting can contribute to a high resilience, since those consumers have found to be more knowledgeably regarding public affairs issues, and they are more likely to be exposed to high quality information, as well as the verification of false claims. And we therefore expect that the use of PSB makes people more resilient to disinformation. And hypothesis 5, we argued that citizens who obtain information from various established news sources are more likely to be confronted with different opinions and not mainly with undisputed and potentially false statements. And we therefore expect citizens with a diverse news diet to be more resilient to disinformation. And finally, social media creates a suitable environment for the spread of disinformation. Here we expect high social media use, as well as very active social media use, to make citizens less resilient to disinformation. So how did we design the study? We conducted an online survey in 6 Western democracies, namely Belgium, Switzerland, Germany, France, UK, and the US, which are all part of the different resilience clusters in the, from the framework, which indicates different levels of resilience to disinformation. And the samples are nationally representative, and we collected the data during 4 weeks in April and May. The measures include demographics, then trust in the news, the media use of the respondents, their political orientation, voting intention, as well as social media use and activity. And we measured our dependent variable by asking the respondents how they intend to react to a social media post presented, and how likely it is that they would like, share, or comment on the post on a scale from 1 very unlikely to 7 very likely. And we constructed the social media posts with false claims around 3 different topics, which were taken from fact-checking websites and which were related to the coronavirus, to climate change protests, and to immigration. So what did we find in our study? To start with the research question on country differences, in the intention to not spread disinformation, we ran analysis of variance to estimate mean differences across the 6 countries per topic. And for each topic, the results show significant country differences, and 3 distinct groups of countries were revealed. Respondents in Switzerland did react less to disinformation, to the disinformation posts than respondents from other European countries and from the US. And in contrast, the US citizens were most willing to spread all 3 claims of disinformation. And further, there were no differences between the 3 topics, and all stimuli seem to have evoked a similar behavior across the countries. In our hypotheses, we now wanted to test different factors predicting the resilience to disinformation on the individual level. And we ran 3 models per country, starting with control variables and political predictors, then added the news media predictors, and lastly, the social media predictors. And in our paper, you can find all 3 regression models, but here are only the values of the last model presented with all of the factors in it. Okay, so first we see that citizens who use alternative media are the least resilient to disinformation, and this is a very strong predictor across all countries under study. Also, the more frequent use of social media and the more active they are using it, the less resilient they are to sharing disinformation. And these factors also have an influence across all countries, which is in line with previous research showing that social media facilitates the spread of online disinformation. And in contrast, some country differences in terms of the factors exist. In terms of partisanship, we expected a negative relationship with resilience to disinformation. Here in Model 3, we see a negative influence only in Germany and France. For the US and UK, there was a significant effect in Model 1, which disappeared in the second model when the media variables were added. So this points maybe to a relationship between partisanship and the news consumption variables, for example, with alternative media use. In our second hypothesis, we assumed that the voting intention for a populist party is negatively related to resilience to disinformation. And the results show that voting intentions have a significantly negative effect in all countries in which a populist party was identified. However, in France and Switzerland, the effects are also, again, not longer significant in Model 2, which suggests an intercorrelation with the use of alternative media. In our third hypothesis on media trust, we expected a positive influence on resilience, which we cannot confirm in our regression models. There were no significant effects and even a weak negative effect in Germany and the UK. And in terms of the expected positive influence of the public service broadcasting use, we can only confirm the positive effect on resilience in France. French users on the national PSB were less willing to disseminate disinformation. And lastly, following the argument that a diverse news diet would foster the resilience, we can confirm this in our study only for Germany and the US. So to conclude, we first saw that resilience at the country level can explain the individual's engagement with disinformation. And in terms of the resilience factors, some factors are strong across all countries. And however, there are some factors which are relevant to different degrees in different countries. In general, heavy users of alternative media and those who make intensive use of social media are particularly at risk. Here for this target group in all countries, for example, social media campaigns could help, like those by the European Commission or the United Nations, where they call for pausing and thinking before sharing. And regarding the differences per country in terms of PSB and the diverse media use, our results so far show that, especially in France, strengthening public service media could be fruitful. And in the US, a way to go to increase the resilience could be to burst the bubbles and foster a diverse news diet of the citizens. And overall, our results underline the need to analyze and interpret multi-country data in context-sensitive manner. And finally, we have to keep in mind that we conducted the study during an exceptional situation with a lot of countries facing lockdowns, and that this, as well as the scope of the pandemic in each country, might have affected our results. And regarding the limitations of the study, next to the US, we included 5 European countries in our sample, but we only focused on Western democracies. And therefore, our results are not transferable to countries with completely different political, media, and economic environments. Also, we used radical right-wing leaning claims in the stimuli, which might be most appealing to right-wing oriented respondents. And therefore, future research should investigate whether disinformation on left-wing issues appeals to other groups of citizens and to identify additional drivers for its dissemination. And yes, with this, I would like to thank you very much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Anna. That was very interesting. We had a flurry of questions asked in the last couple of minutes, so that should keep us busy for the next several minutes that we have in this session. Christian Barden asks, what do you make of the disconfirmed hate hypothesis 3A? Why might media trust decrease resilience?
Yes, this is a point and a result we discussed or most in our team. And we were also very surprised for this finding. I can share some thoughts. We don't have a clear explanation for it yet. So what we discussed was that we saw also in the digital news report from the Reuters Institute that there was during the pandemic generally a very high trust in the news, or that citizens in a lot of countries consumed traditional media more often. So this could be one explanation, that there was generally a very high trust. But it seems that it's also very challenging to measure trust. As I remember in Strömbeck and colleagues' paper on trust, where they discuss different layers or different levels of trust, and it's very hard to tell of what people actually think of when we ask them, do you trust the media? Or if they trust the media in general, or a specific outlet, or a journalist, or a story. So this is one, the measurement is also very, very challenging, and maybe, I know, for future research, we did this with the alternative media use, that you present specific outlets and ask them, do you trust this outlet? This leads to a very extensive list, and especially for comparative research. But maybe additionally, to established scales could be a way to go, to ask open questions and ask which are your 3 most trusted outlets, or your least trusted outlets, just as to maybe come to to better know what people actually think of when we ask them these questions. But besides that, I assume that there was generally a very high trust in our sample, because it was in all countries over the mean, over 4. And I expect that there was just not, the variance of the variable was not that high during the time of the crisis. But
can I quickly jump in?
Of course.
Because I see other people answering the same question. There's one alternative explanation, in addition to what Anna said, is that we presented them stimuli coming from a non-existent source called news.com. So it might be that some people still see this as a trusted news source. We don't know this. We thought about keeping the source constant, because of course it would create great variation, but that might have influenced the somewhat intriguing or surprising results on media trust.
Yes, thank you. This especially could explain that not that there is no effect, but that there is a negative or the opposite effect.
Great. So the next question is from Sarah. Don't know if this would be a shorter answer, but she asked, did you measure if they perceive the messages as disinformation? So to what extent do people, I suppose, actively identify disinformation?
Yes, we discussed. No, we haven't included this. We just asked the people if they support the claim we showed them, but we didn't ask them if they perceive it as true or false. So, because the broader research interest was more in the other factors and why they shared it, no matter if they think it's true or false. So but we have a variable where we ask if they at least support it.
Okay, I'm going to group a few questions together, which are, I think you could say, about sort of independent variables. So Jamaluddin, for instance, says, what is your specific observation about the gender aspect of resilience? Kurd asks, did you consider including positive traits such as sense of civic responsibility? And there's a question from Diego about religion. So for instance, Catholic voters versus Protestant voters, atheists, and so forth. So I hope you don't mind me bunching those kinds of questions together, the kinds of traits that people might have that might have an impact on the direction of these results.
I'm not sure if I got all of the variables, but yes, we also saw some interesting differences in our socio-demographic variables. For gender, we are not having I looked at this in more detail, but we plan to do it. But what we saw, as I remember it, it was more, in most countries, it was more men, more older men to sum it up, but I can't just tell you this to this point now, and I don't know if it's exactly in all of the countries, but we saw an effect there. Another thing was...
Sorry, the other ones were about civic responsibility, and then there was one about religion. I don't know if that helps.
Religion we didn't ask, and civic responsibility, I don't remember. What was the question there?
So sorry, the question was, did you consider also including positive traits such as sense of civic responsibility, etc.?
Oh, okay. As far as I know, we didn't.
Good suggestion for further research, but I don't think we included that one.
Yes, because especially yes, in terms of the resilience. No. Yes, just one small thing maybe to add from the demographics, that we also saw that in which maybe could help in all of the countries, no matter if it was Western democracy or which country ever, that age should not be underestimated, and there should maybe be education on every age level, and not just for the youngest, but also for middle, older generations. We saw an effect there a little.
Sure, we have a couple of observations. Perhaps you want to comment on them. Christian says, being intrigued by the null or negative findings with regards to trust in news. Obviously, we've already covered this to a certain extent, but perhaps this suggests that trust in news often denotes healthy skepticism rather than more problematic cynicism. And Renee says, I wonder if people's social media network also helps in decreasing or increasing their resilience to disinformation. For example, if their friends online call them out when they share disinformation. So I don't know if you want to comment on those in turn.
Yes, I think this is very helpful and interesting.
Okay, yeah, no problem.
I don't know if Peter has a comment right now. I just noted it down and want to think about it more. But
great, thank you very much. It's obviously created quite an interesting discussion, and that can be continued in the chat as required. We're running up now to about time, so I'll pass over to Christian and we can move on to the next session. But I'd like to thank everyone for some very interesting presentations, and I think it really speaks to a lot of the concerns in this area around political disinformation. So thanks everyone.